Hi, welcome to the Hourly Podcast. Today, we have an amazing conversation with Eric Frederick. Eric is a longtime, seasoned executive at large organizations like Fairway, second time around, and most recently, the CEO of Uno's Pizzeria and Grill. I love talking to him about the hourly workforce and the lessons he learned about people back in his early days at the U.S. Navy. Enjoy. That means it's working. Hey, Eric, it's so good to see you again.
Good seeing you, AJ.
Yeah, and thanks for coming on the pod. Eric, for those of you that don't know, storied CEO and CFO across different industries, all pertaining to the hourly workforce. He's had stints at Uno restaurant, which is where I had a lot of dates with my wife in Syracuse, New York. Believe it or not, Fairway, which is a grocer, second time around, which is a large retail chain, Staples, and a brief stint at the Navy. But Eric, thanks for being on. And I know we've talked a little bit in the past about your time in the Navy. Let's start there.
Sure.
What important lessons did you learn with the United States Navy, and how on earth did you end up as the CEO of Uno from your stint there?
Sure. Well, it was sort of a long progression. I went. I was in the Navy after college. I went in Navy ROTC program, so I owed them some time, but and everything. But phenomenal experience, put me through college. But really, that's where I learned a lot of skills. I learned the difference that one of the great sayings I learned was managers do things right, leaders do the right thing, and the really best do them both. And I mean, that was sort of the overarching part of what I learned. And, like in a great, probably one of the best examples of where those intertwine was really getting down with your people, right? Because, of course you want to look at the metrics and all that kind of thing as to what's happening. And, we had our own for different things. But you have to actually see what's happening, out there with your people to really understand, what's happening. I translated that to the restaurant business or retailers by spending time in the actual stores with them. And don't get me wrong, I love the PR value of Undercover Boss. But realistically, if you have to do that to learn about your business, you should have been there a long time ago. And I think that's true for most of the folks that do it. But and the other great thing about coming out of the military is you get all walks of life. You get people who come from very wealthy backgrounds, to people who come off of a farm, to people who came out of gangs in inner cities, to just your average middle class person. So it was a terrific experience and the foundation of my leadership skills.
Yeah, that's great. And you said something really special there about importance of people, getting your units and gross, right? Of course, culture is important, but that's a real metric that you use. And it's one of the top 5 things that you mentioned in your trophy case, if you will, of what you've been successful at. So talk to me a little about that. Let's start. Why is that metric important? And how have you defined it in the past? And how does it contributed to all of your growth?
Like it or not, you have a culture, and whether that's the culture you want or not is pretty much up to the leadership team, as driven by the CEO. HR is helpful, but they can't own driving your culture. That comes from the CEO. And I'll give you an example. I spent years at Staples, and at least in the home office, being analytical and smart was a very positive thing, and something that defined who was successful there and who was not. But I wouldn't say that was true at Uno at all. We had a terrific culture. We had one of our sort of core values was genuine kindness. It fit in the hospitality. I'm not saying they were jerks at Staples, but I'm saying genuine kindness would not have set them apart. So every company has that, and you have to. But what's important about that is there's elements of culture that are bad, and you have to get rid of them or counterproductive to what you're trying to do, and they will frame your strategy more than you know, and how you want to do things. So that is a big part, and you have to take your culture and either accept it as it is, harness the good parts, and take it someplace else, Or you have to say, we need to change our culture, be super clear about how you get there, probably build that with consensus. And then you've got to reward those who walk the walk and frankly be ready to make the hard decisions about people who are not, and especially with senior leadership.
Right.
But to get down to how do you measure that, one of the things that I've, the kind of managerial bag of tricks, if you will, is just engagement scores. And the Gallup organization has a really good one that they've used in a lot of big companies. At the end of the day, they really come down to, do you want to be working here a year from now? Are you treated with respect? Would you recommend your friends to come here? And really, when you kind of get down to that, there's a lot of other things you can drill into so that you can prove, do you have the tools you need? Is it a safe place to work? If it's an unsafe place to work, they're probably not going to want to be there in a year from now. But it is a good drill into, how you get a better score, things you can do and whatnot. In my experience, which whether retail or restaurant, Multisite has probably as many similarities, whether it's retail or restaurant, as they do differences. But one thing that is absolutely clear and evidenced, in the numbers is, if you make a list, if you do an engagement survey, and again, just how excited are people to work there, you do go
Right.
top to bottom, and then you make a list of most profitable to least profitable, right? It's the same list. It really is, and more often than not,
Why do you think that is? Let's double tap there, because that's so interesting what you said. You said there's a direct correlation between employment engagement surveys and happiness and performance of those restaurants,
yeah.
right? So
Well,
why do you think
yeah,
that is?
no, it's a great question, and one of the things is, I will always take an A manager in a B minus location over a B minus manager in an A location. And the reason is, and listen, I've got, when I was at Uno, I had this manager who had an Uno on the wrong side of a dead mall in Bangor, Maine, and this guy crushed it. He was an
Right.
amazing leader. His people loved to work for him, and they loved to. And
Yeah.
so when I'd go up there and visit, when the food came out of the kitchen, you just wanted to take a picture of everything that came out. The place had
Mhm.
a vibe to it. The servers were genuinely friendly. They weren't like reading from a script.
Right.
And his assistant general manager made the place look absolutely stunning on the way out, on the way in, because she just had pride and all that kind of thing. You don't get that if you're not engaged, with the business, and you're just kind of punching a time clock, or waiting for the next W-2. And they would, great, they're horrible locations, so they would get catering orders, and they,
Right.
what do you do with a
Right.
dead mall parking lot? You have a flea market, so they would set up a stand, and you go the extra mile, and that
Right.
happens when you love what you're doing and you love your job.
Right. And when you think of corporate and the individual general manager, and then of course the crew members, there's a lot of responsibility for the customer care, right? And we talk about culture, and I know there's listeners on the pod that are from, the CEO of major corporations to franchisees with 10 to 15 locations to single unit general managers and everything in between. So when you think about culture, you're talking about from establishing the core values from a corporate, the CEO of Uno's International, if you will. And then with the Bangor, Maine example, you're talking about the general manager buying into that, right? And, how important would you say, or what are some, let me rephrase that. What are some things that corporate can do to ensure that at the ground level, the core values of the business are being played out?
Well, I would take that in the opposite direction. And one
Oh,
of the
okay.
things that we did
Love
at
it.
Uno is, we said, what are our core values? It wasn't me and my leadership team coming down from the mountain, and
Right.
saying, this is what they are. And by the way, when we established ours, we didn't want to do table stakes, and
Mm,
we didn't want to have, integrity and respect for others. We wanted things that you're like, what's truly unique about here, and who wins, and those are antes to the game. You better have those things to show up to
right.
work here. We went the other way. We split up in different groups, and we said, who is really successful here that if we could put in front of people to say this is the exemplar of the culture that we want to have, who would they be? And so we kind of tried to narrow that list down to like 4 to 6 or something like that. And then we had this long list of adjectives, and we went through and said, what are the adjectives that really best describe these people? And you can't use them all. You can only use 4 or 5. And that's the hard part, is you really break it down. And so guys like my general manager in Bangor, guys like one of my franchisees in Philadelphia, a
Right.
couple of my fellows in IT, they were like unanimous. This is what we want out of people. And then we described it in ways that would follow. And so we really took the good parts of the culture, and everybody got it. They're like, oh yeah, that's exactly who's successful here, and really leverage the good parts of what we had rather than saying, hey, this is what it's going to be. And look, Uno's is an amazing place. Nike is a great company. My understanding of Nike is it's a very competitive culture in a very good way. Go figure, right? You know who they are. But competitiveness would not have been a word I would use to describe people at Uno, and I think it would have been counterproductive to bring something like that in.
Right.
And not that that's a bad attribute, but I go back to your culture sort of is what it is. One, there are a couple things I inserted, myself, and some of them come back to the military, and less cultural values, but more like things like one thing that got us through COVID is I'm a very, very big believer in the law and the adage that players may win the game, but it takes a team to beat the odds.
Mm.
And teamwork was such a huge part of our culture that I know being in Multisite and other places, the willingness to help other people and send their people over, even though when they were short, to help somebody else keep open, was just absolutely phenomenal. People are like, oh my God, you took over Uno in April of 2020. How hard was that?
Tough time. It's a tough time.
Well, but I had a lot of elements of an amazing culture behind it. And great, there was some financial things that we had to do and some cost savings, but I got to tell you, if we didn't have that amazing culture in place, that we could really leverage on some of those things, and build on, probably wouldn't have happened, and so and so really driving that, it makes a big difference, and it's got to go in your hiring, and it's got to go in. If someone doesn't fit that culture, they got to go. And
Yeah.
people
And I know,
and
yeah. And I know, like, famously, Uno's did some amazing things during COVID to help their employees, help those in the distribution centers. Can you touch on those really briefly for our audience?
yeah, so a couple things is your people need to know, one, where you're going. And I gave you a great example on that before, and maybe come back to it. But the other is they want to know that you genuinely care about them as a human being. So a couple
Right.
things that we did is, if you remember back to the days when the vaccines first came out, it was just nearly impossible to get an appointment. You had to,
Right.
press refresh on your website or be on
Yeah,
hold.
my wife and I drove like 2.5 hours to No Town, South Carolina, where there was one CVS that was available and that was willing to do it for us.
Yeah,
Right. Which seems
yeah.
crazy right now. Like, we're going to be telling our kids stories about the time Omicron came down and everybody was losing their minds. But keep
Yeah.
going. Keep going. Yeah.
Yeah. So imagine somebody working, a shift. And by the way, we had a CPG, frozen pizza manufacturing business in addition
Right.
to the restaurants. So they don't they're not able to be on the phone. You're cooking or you're
Right.
serving, and you can't hit refresh and all that. So what we did, and the other thing too is you and I did all this in English. So a
Mm,
lot of restaurant workers and people who worked in our factory, they spoke a dialect of Portuguese. And so if you think about their
yeah.
ability to consume information of what's out there, right? Very, very difficult. So what we did is we set up a help desk where we literally took their information and we set up their appointments for them. And in one case, where our factory was, we were able to work with the local health department, and they came in because we had such a concentration of people. They came in and did the vaccines there, and then we invited our restaurant people to come there because it was a central place and all
Wow.
of that.
Yeah.
And so we had in our plant a 92% vax rate. We didn't make it mandatory or anything like that. And this is among a population that generally was in the 40s when you
Wow.
looked at their demographics.
Yeah.
So we demonstrated we cared. And then in our restaurants, these men and women worked nonstop. I mean, during COVID, it was you were answering the phone, making the pizza, and then running out to the car. And so what we did is we gave everybody, all the general managers, a round trip ticket for two anywhere in the continental United States. Coach. But anyways, and but we asked them to post on social media their experience wherever they were.
Mm.
They were with their mom. They were in Vegas.
What were some of those stories? I mean, like, what photos did you see? Was it mostly beaches and Disney, or were you surprised by some?
You know what? The I wouldn't say surprise. There was a fair amount of Vegas and Disney. That's
Right.
definitely for sure, and all that.
Those with kids, those without kids, probably between those
Yes.
two.
Yeah. Right. But the ones that kind of touched me, I mean, there was one person who said, "Look, I don't want to travel, but my mom lives in Puerto Rico. Do you mind if I fly her here?" I'm like, "Oh,
Wow. Yeah.
okay."
Yeah. Yeah.
No, that's the easiest thing in the world. That
Right.
was touching. And there are a few things where families got together. But what
Right.
was really cool, and I didn't even think this through when we implemented it. Well, of course they're not all going to take vacation at once. So when they posted on social media, it was like every week, every other week, somebody was just saying, "Wow, what a great thing this is." And they had the experience and all that kind of thing. And from a financial perspective, it was not that big of a deal.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we had a tiered offering for assistant general managers, and our regional directors got a little more. But
Right.
the bottom line is they had an experience, and they were all like, "Wow, what a good place to work," and all that. And not for nothing, the other kind of good thing from a business standpoint was, if you think about it, they needed time off. and
Yeah. Yeah.
so, and
Yeah.
so it kind of got them out.
Yeah.
And,
Well,
it,
it just is so interesting, right? And I talk a lot about this a lot in the book. Is the humanization of the hourly workforce is oftentimes like seldom across different businesses. And for me, this is a really great perk that most businesses probably could swing financially. That provides an opportunity that likely these people, with credit card debt and student loan debt, don't get to do very often,
yeah,
right? And financially, and I know you're a big finance person, it probably costs less than what you would need on a spot bonus, but the intrinsic value and likely the retention from a retention perspective yielded far better outcomes.
100%. 100%. By the way, you said a word I cannot believe is in the English language, and that's called the humanization of.
Yeah.
I mean, fill in the blank. I mean, can you
Yeah.
imagine? Like, I can't imagine. Boy, I wish my board would humanize me. I mean, I
Right.
just, you know,
You take, you talk about it, and I talk about a lot in the book. It's, these workers are oftentimes feel invisible, coining the phrase like the invisible workforce. It's those people that we walk by or we get served by, or, are cleaning our clothes or our houses, and systemically may not have the resources that you and I have to build a better life here in America, right? It's a sad reality, but I think that you across your career, and I know that there's some other examples at Fairway at Second Time Around, where you've made an active decision to treat these employees like humans. And sadly, and my really humble opinion is that doesn't happen very often, right? So what about you and your style and what's important to you as a person drives you to make this impact in people's lives?
well, I mean, a lot of it is just how you're brought up and how you think. And again, I go
Right.
back to my formative years in the Navy where I was lucky enough to work for some just amazing leaders. And anyone who knows anything about how junior officers are, or has ever seen like a war movie, the senior enlisted guys, a big part of their job is to basically teach the young officers how to lead and manage. And I
Right.
was just blessed in having some incredibly patient senior enlisted people and some very inspirational senior officers that were good enough to mentor me and gave me the patience. And And I would argue anything I do good, I was probably awful at some point, and somebody
Right.
was good enough to coach me on it, and took the time to have a difficult conversation to say, here's a better way.
Right.
And I guess my advice to young people is, it's really funny, um, you know, when you coach people as a manager, there's people who, like, take your advice and they go off to the races. There's some people who hear you, but then they don't change. And there's other people who you coach them and they get all defensive and they're like, well, what about you? What about you? And
Yeah.
after a while, you're like, this isn't worth it. You
Right.
know, it's just a hassle.
Right.
But I'm going to keep coaching the person who's good at it.
Right.
And the people who get all defensive, as if any of us are perfect, they don't get coached anymore. And then next thing you know, they're not being promoted, and their career just kind of languishes and they really don't make forward progress.
Right.
And for your manager to come by and say you could do better at this, or you need to improve this, and to go ahead and do it, you're going to get a lot more from that. And any person young in their career, it's one of the best things you can do is seek coaching, and always be grateful for it,
Right.
because it's always intended to make you better.
Yeah, because there isn't statistically a lot of upward mobility for everyone, like across the hourly workforce. And I know this because at Sprockets, where I'm CEO, we have this feature that our customers, so let's say a restaurant signs up, they upload a spreadsheet of all of their past applicants. So these are people who applied 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 2 years ago, 1 year ago, 6 months ago, and like 6 weeks ago. And what we have is AI called JoJo that reaches out to all of these people in batches, encouraging them to come back and work for the company.
Oh, wow.
So instead of, when you need your next 10 people going to a job board and paying for job fairs and all these things, you just kind of bluntly, you harvest your past applicant list and treat them like a community of people rather than a candidate graveyard to come back and work. And it's a long way to get to my point, which is statistically, those that applied 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 1 year ago, 6 months ago, and 6 weeks ago all basically have the same likelihood to reapply for that same job, which is sad, right? So if you applied 10 years ago or 6 weeks ago, the conversion rates are essentially the same.
That's interesting. It's yeah, and I mean, the one thing about certain jobs, and I just especially like server jobs. First off, I think everybody should be a server at some point in their life, and
Yeah.
that what you learn about people and yourself and patience and all that thing, and so but at any rate, but I love what you're doing, and I mean, I think that would be interesting as well for former employees too, to get people to come back, but it doesn't have to be that way. I think what happens is when things are tough, the easiest expense to cut, well, among marketing is probably the easiest and biggest, but cutting training is probably one of the easiest things to do. And when you cut hours, well, I can't cut an hour of you cooking,
Yeah.
but I can definitely cut that training hour.
Right.
And I think that hurts the upward mobility. But again, it's a little bit nearsighted, because when you do that, then okay, well, now you lose your shift supervisor, your manager, your assistant general manager, and you end up having to go to the outside. And then your people are like, there is no upward mobility here. Well, of course not, because you didn't train them.
Right.
And now,
Right.
by the way, you better hope where the other folks came from, that their company did a good job of training, because that's what you're going to get.
Right.
And and I don't care. The funny thing is about hiring from the outside. You look at a resume, you're like, oh my God, I wish we had people like this, because
Right.
I mean,
Right.
the funny thing is, if you look at my resume, it's got some, accomplishments and all that kind of thing. I could write 20 pages of, here are the mistakes I made, I won't do on your dime.
Right. Right.
So,
Yeah, and like one of the reasons why I was so excited to have you on the pod is, others in the industry know you as somebody who, really goes against that grain, invest in people, and I think, maybe consciously, subconsciously fight that that static workforce that really never gets trained on. You kind of see them as numbers and they just become gears in the machine. Right. And I think that's a testament to you and the work that you've done and the impact you've been able to have on a lot of people's lives. Right. Because I think as leaders and, these CEOs of these large corporations, yourself included, you have a lot of opportunity to make a profound difference in the workforce's lives, right? And that's far beyond them having a pulse or being able to follow the mirror. You've done a great job of that, right? And it's just so interesting to kind of hear you always bring it back to that Navy, how you were brought up and all of these things. And the way you talk about it, I kind of saw your reaction to that stat. It's like, to you, it's blasphemous, right? That people wouldn't invest in their people, right? And what I'm wondering is, do you believe you're in the majority and that a lot of leaders are very people centric, culture centric like you, or do you think that you're in the minority of the hourly workers?
Well, so I one thing I want to say is, and again, it goes back to sort of my military. You take care of your people, that'll take, and you take care of the mission. Both are intertwined,
Mm,
and honestly, you better believe this isn't just like great soft, on people and all that kind of thing. We measure stats like productivity and I talked about profitability, but hey, how many guests per labor hour are you doing? And that's how you got that profitability. Food
right,
costs pretty much the same, all that kind of, wherever they'll have less waste, of course, but it is very, very much intertwined with just smart business. So
right,
I don't for a second think that it's, gee, you have to be hard nosed and not care about your people, or you do both. You do it the right way, right?
right,
By the way, the right way says bad actors have to go,
right.
or don't get hired. So, but in terms of the majority or the minority, you know, I would say from my prism, my perspective, I do think it's the majority, but I would also say that's who I surround myself with, and I just,
Right. Good
you know,
people find good people. Yeah.
if it's on your to-do list that, a week from Thursday, you're going to think about humanizing your people, you're probably not somebody I want to have a pizza with.
Right. No, that's a good point. It's a good point, right? And I know that what's interesting about your background is it's not exclusively in restaurants, right? You've been in retail at Staples and second time around,
Well, I worked for an
grocer,
investment bank for 3 years.
yeah, grocer at Fairway. And when you think about the ground level employees that you've had across these different industries, did you see any nuances or differences or, any learnings that you'd like to share with the audience across those?
Well, in multi-site, and I'm not sure this isn't true for anything, or for even non-multi-site. The general manager was make or break, uh,
Mm,
and that was sort of the critical thing. And if you took care of them, and made sure you had the right ones in there and they were right for your culture, that was important. Now, we didn't hire every general manager that we hired. I personally interviewed, and if I could get in front of them in person, I would, because it's
interesting.
that
Yeah.
important. They are a first round draft choice, and you have to know them. And look, hopefully you're not hiring too many. Now, you can't always do that, and you get to the point where you've got a massive organization. But every now and then, and by the way, it goes a long, long way to do
Right.
that kind of thing. But that to me was sort of the real big trick. And I've seen great restaurants or stores become bad ones because you change management, and you gotta watch them early on, and if that's the point, you got to coach them up, and if they can't, then you got to move on.
Yeah.
In other cases, I've seen, really good managers take over, it's like, oh, it's just a bad location,
Right.
or what have you. And then you put in a good manager. I worked in a retailer there. They had comps that were up 30% in an established market,
Right.
after we brought on a new manager. And so that would be my one big advice. And there is an old adage too, that there wouldn't be an old adage if there wasn't some truth to it, that people don't leave companies, they leave managers. And a
Y-
lot of sense, that's very, very true, because they set the tone. Nobody wants to go to work and have it be miserable.
Yeah. And so what would you say to, we'll say, an operator with 10 locations? They've identified that they have a troubled manager. What's some coaching you would give them of what to do, and maybe some concrete steps to get things in the right direction?
Yeah, sure. So, look, whether, you got 1,000 or 10, first off, I'm going to assume they have the skill set to the technical skill sets to run their,
Right.
retail or whatever that is.
Yep.
And, and I think you have to really be very clear with them and isolate, these are the things that have to get better. Right. And by the way, no one's perfect. No one's 100% imperfect. I do think you reinforce what is working and what's not, but then you have to time box it and say, look, you're going to be 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Right. We all have our own sort of like, this is always joke. This is for your Eric's not a perfect person file.
Yep.
Sorry about that. And that's going to happen, but you should know what good looks like and what that progress is and all that kind of thing. And you've got to monitor it, because if you don't, that restaurant's going to spiral. And if you think about just a place where people come and go maybe once a quarter, just to keep the math simple,
Yeah.
you let that go for too long, and you people say, oh, I had a bad experience. Maybe that was a one-off. Now they come back the next quarter. And, and I know people don't think about quarters, but just, over they
I hear
back
you.
the second time, 6 months goes by real quick. And if they
Right.
have 2 bad experiences in a row, you just lost a customer. And I don't care if you're selling,
Yep.
commercial jets or a hair salon. The most expensive thing in the world is a customer. Therefore, the biggest thing you can lose is a customer.
Interesting.
So,
Yeah.
so you got to be super, super careful, about, hey, this is what it looks like. We did in one of the retailers we had a really good person who's probably promoted a little bit too early, but it didn't matter. We weren't ready to pull him back out and everything. And so we paired him up with one of our best. And, because one thing about Multisite is you're kind of out there on your own.
Yeah,
You're
for
not,
sure.
you work in a corporate office, there's lots of people around and you get to compare yourself and all that. But being out there by yourself, sometimes you do need to bring in someone really good to kind of, buddy up with them, if you will. So.
Right. Right. And what would you say if you are that same operator and you just know the person's too far gone, right? They just have made too many mistakes, or they're not respectful to everybody, and you need to make a move. Do you put out job requisites and you start looking and then you replace them once the switch happens? Or are you of the mind that you terminate the minute there's a problem, give somebody an interim position, and kind of solve it that way?
Well, I think it depends on, there's a spectrum, right? There's certain things that you're just terminated today and we'll figure
Right.
it out. You
Right.
just,
Yeah. The
we
non-negotiable.
that.
Yep. Yep. Totally
If
get that.
you think racism or sexism or any,
Yep.
sexual harassment, there's no second chance. If you've been living under a rock for 30 years,
Right.
don't get that.
Right.
You're just gone that day. And so, but there are other things of like, hey, we're hearing noise, you're rude to your people,
Right.
or, that's a counseling session. And
Mm,
that's a, depending on where they are and everything, you've got this amount of time to change or what have you, and we're going to watch you and all that kind of, but if it's just part of your personality and or whatever it is, it that is not fitting with what we need out of this culture, then you got to go.
This episode is brought to you by JoJo, an AI virtual recruiter powered by Sprockets. Designed for the hourly workforce, JoJo works 24/7 to source, screen, and schedule interviews with the best applicants for your business. JoJo helps reduce employee turnover and time spent hiring so you and your team can focus on other important tasks. To learn more, head to sprockets.ai/JoJo.
And if they
right.
don't fit in, then they should get some place where they're going to be comfortable and their style works. But that's for them to solve, not for me.
Got it. So, from this, one of the sections of our book is different perks that big brands have provided to the hourly workforce to, in the word that you described as interesting and intrigue, humanize the hourly workforce. I've heard a few today that any operator, any franchisor could present to their hourly workers, and it add a lot of value to them for productivity as well as making your people feel seen. Right, one being the flights domestically to anywhere in the country. That's amazing. I've never heard that before. Second is I'd say like medical assistance, right, with the COVID vaccines and COVID support. I've heard other things like mentorship, right? You put this general manager that's new and green with another manager. Any others that you've played around with in your various positions that were great and maybe to another operator that's struggling with culture, they can adopt to see some production?
Yeah, so one thing that worked for Uno that would not have worked at Fairway. Fairway was everybody was in New York, but Uno,
Yeah.
is kind of a legacy, just a iconic brand that was started in Chicago in 1943. And so every now and then we'll have a contest of whatever bartender comes up with a new seasonal drink.
Oh, that's cool.
They get a trip to Chicago to the mothership, and we'll put them up at, for a couple nights, and they can bring a buddy or a spouse or whatever. And that's short money. It gets people engaged. It gets people talking about it, and it's fun. Does that apply everywhere? No, it doesn't. I worked for a retailer in LA that had stores all over the country, and we flew them to LA, and we gave them tickets to, Universal Studios, and we put them up in a nice hotel, a nicer hotel than they would ordinarily. It doesn't have to be the Ritz, but if it's nicer than where they're ordinarily staying, they feel like magic. Those are the easiest things in the world. You don't have to do it constantly. You don't have to write your employee handbook, and they just make things fun and interesting.
Love it. Love it. All right. Last question for you. And again, thank you very much for being on the podcast. I know everyone's probably taking notes just like I am. What was your first ever job? And last question, part B, is were you terminated or did you leave said job?
Well, it's a funny story. So my dad was a very small drywall contractor. And so probably in sixth grade, I'm sure we broke every labor law in the book. I would, get dropped off at a construction site and sweep the floors and clean up and do all this good stuff. And I sanded drywall, and anybody who knows what that is once you've sanded drywall, there's no job beneath you. And so at any rate, I mean, that was sort of my first job, but I was making money and all that, and but I wouldn't say I got fired. But when it came time to start talking about the career path, I'm adopted, and I just wired a little bit different. I won the lottery of adopted parents, and my dad said, Eric, you're just not that great with your hands. You're going to have to get a desk job.
You should find something else to do. No, I love it. That's like
I wouldn't say fired, but dissuaded from the family business.
I might say that's fired. After hearing that. I have a similar story. So my father-in-law, we were stone and oiling a very long driveway together. And I was on break, and I came in just not the same outfit as everybody else. I was in like Abercrombie jeans, Timberland boots, and like a Phillips Exeter Academy shirt. Like nice. I was not fitting in whatsoever. And I worked really hard. I did my very, very best. And then I was supposed to work the second day, but the invitation never came. I didn't get woken up. I was supposed to just do it for 3-4 days, and over dinner was like nothing happened. So I feel like I was fired. So respectfully, I'm gonna put you in the same bucket as me. If that's okay. No, but Eric, thank you so much. If somebody wants to get in touch with you, follow your journey, what's the best way to do that?
Well, LinkedIn is probably the easiest, and just connect with me. And one of the things I like to do when people who I don't know connect with me on LinkedIn is just have a quick 15-minute get to know you, and it takes sort of like, okay, great, we connected, but I don't know the first thing about you. So like maybe something real. And you'd be
Right.
surprised where some have gone. The majority don't go too far, but some have turned into some pretty good business one way or another.
Hey,
So
that's how we met. That's how we met too.
kind
So
of,
I can
yeah,
attest to
it's
that.
just, hey, let's talk, and
Right.
so at any rate, yeah, just Eric Frederick, LinkedIn, just search for me and I'll come right up.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you so much again for being on the pod. And I'm sure our audience really enjoyed today's session. We'll continue to keep everybody updated as we get more and more guests here on the Hourly podcast. Thank you.
All right, AJ.
All right, have a good one.